Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 10th of December. Just getting ready for the Mindfield.
This is the theme music from a show called The Deuce, opening up this edition of the Mindfield as we try to negotiate the ethical and moral dilemmas of modern life. That is a show that, at least for Scott, provides a bit of an ethical and moral dilemma, which we'll expound upon shortly. But it's wonderful to have your company. Waleed Ali is my name. My co-host is the very confused and conflicted Scott Steele.
Always confused. Can I tell you the most confused that I've been in recent times?
Really?
It's when Ben Affleck was announced as the new Batman.
Oh, really?
Yes, because you've got an actor that I really have never very much liked, and then you cast him in the role that I most revere. I mean, it was the crisis of conscience, the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul. Did you?
Well, like how it went on a meta level. That's brilliant. I actually thought he was really good.
Well, yes. You see, I actually think he was quite good. Oh, we're not talking about Batman. Good heavens, what are we doing?
We're not, but we can.
But I did actually think that he was. I think that he was probably the most convincing Bruce Wayne that we had ever seen, even more than Christian Bale. So, but at the time, what I'm saying is that it really did a number on me. Not quite as much, though, as when I found out that David Simon's most recent effort, called The Deuce, was exploring the rise of the porn industry in 1970s New York. Now, look, Waleed,
why would that cause you to be conflicted?
Tell me about it. Well, I mean, I love David Simon. I think some of the work that he's done over the last sort of decade and a half has been quite extraordinary. Not just extraordinary aesthetically in terms of what's possible on television, but also morally probing in a way. Even sort of aesthetically beautiful in a way that I don't.
So The Wire being perhaps
the Wire, absolutely. I mean, that is a work of genius, it seems to me. But also the way that he translated Lisa Belkin's book of investigative journalism called "Show Me a Hero," exploring the struggle for public housing in a highly segregated, heavily segregated suburb of New York called Yonkers. He turned that into a miniseries a couple of years ago, which again was just a work of genius. And so I like the way that he approaches things. I love his approach to storytelling. I like the moral seriousness without moralism that he brings to it. But, you know, pornography, as we've discussed on other programs, you know, the ubiquity of porn today, the normalization of porn, the pornification of so many aspects of modern culture, I think is a really, really serious issue that doesn't attract anything like the kind of deeper moral and political consideration that it's due. And so I was just worried that this would become yet another kind of, you know, form of titillation, of sensationalism. But I've got to say, Waleed, what David Simon has done here is really, really interesting, because what he's managed to track is the beginnings of what he describes as the culturalization of the pornographic, how it was that a form of objectification that, you know, over the subsequent 50 years has left no corner of Western culture untouched, how that process of objectification was legalized, legitimated, and eventually became, if you like, normalized. But what I think is interesting about it is that he's done it without moralizing. He's no moralist. He's no Puritan. He's not trying to denounce anything. But what he is saying is that far too much of Western culture has been far too uncritically accommodating of what porn has brought into the mainstream of Western life, the ubiquity of its effects. And so what he's doing in the show is to say, let's just take stock for a moment on what exactly it is that porn hath wrought. The question that I'd like to put to you, though, isn't just about porn. I mean, you know, that's kind of what we're discussing here. But it's also the deeper logic of political and moral liberalism that did not see porn, and has never really seen porn since the mid-1970s, as being in any way problematic. That porn doesn't defend the two cardinal principles of political liberalism. On the one hand, the principle of freedom of expression, or freedom of speech, and on the other hand, the so-called harm principle. Is this something that is doing harm by its production, circulation, ubiquity? And to my mind, the very fact that the ubiquity of porn is not seen as violating either principle, for me reveals something of the bankruptcy at the heart of political liberalism itself. It represents a misunderstanding of, I think, what is entailed in both of those principles?
Is it a misunderstanding, or does it just reflect the inherent limitations of those principles? I mean, certainly porn doesn't violate any concept of free speech. It's the embodiment of that idea. The only real limitation you could put on it would be the harm principle. I guess what I've always felt about the harm principle is that it's a very promiscuous principle, really. Sorry, that was an unintended pun, I suppose. It was always really in the hands of the person using it or choosing to define it, and you could define it in a really direct, narrow way, which would thereby let in all kinds of things that could be harmful in a broader sense, or you could define it so broadly that you bring liberalism undone, so that there's not really much point to liberalism at all. I guess what I'm saying is the way that we tend to conceive of liberalism means, and of the harm principle within it, means that it's not really very good, it's not very well calibrated to dealing with what you might call the atmospherics of, or harm that is done through the atmospherics, through the music of what it does to a culture, to the underlying base material of a culture. Really, for it to have any liberal meaning, it has to be a kind of direct, more or less unambiguous harm. And that then becomes a problem, and we see this really around free speech debates all the time, don't we? I mean, if you think about the question of hate speech, for example, really what that is a contest over precisely what the limitations and the contours are of the harm principle. Is saying really, really hateful things about, even specific targeted groups of people. Is that a direct form of harm? Or is that merely a form of expression that should be taken care of in the marketplace of ideas? Precisely what level of faith do we have in that marketplace of ideas? How far do we take the analogy of the marketplace? Do we assume that it only works as long as it functions and it has functional working assumptions that do underpin the logic of the marketplace, like, I don't know, perfect information, whatever? How do you reckon? How do you reckon with huge disparities in social power that are brought to the marketplace of ideas and thereby crowd out certain notions of, certain speech, I suppose, is the best way to do it. And to what extent does the presence of hate speech, or the presence of, to take the example you're mentioning here, the presence of pornography, to what extent does that crowd out other forms of speech that liberalism doesn't reckon with? Because as far as liberalism is concerned, there is a formal ability to say whatever you want, even if there's not necessarily a practical ability. So you kind of put your finger on, I think, the inherent problems of liberalism. I guess what I would suggest is, I'm interested in the way you've couched it as a misinterpretation. It feels to me like an inherent limitation. And that ultimately what you have is liberalism which begins with an acknowledgement of the cultural undergirdings that make liberalism possible, but can only really ultimately, particularly in its neoliberal forms, can only really end with an acultural form of politics that just progressively erodes whatever cultural scaffolding might have placed informal restraints, shall we say, on hate speech, pornography, whatever it is. That is the problematic example we're trying to grapple with. So I'm not sure how far liberalism takes us in the face of these things.
Well, see, here's what I'd like to say, that liberalism has the potential of actually taking us maybe a lot further than that, its limitations notwithstanding. Let me just point out two things, and I'm deeply resonant with what you just said. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that, hate speech, for instance, already is given its formal limitation at the point of incitement. When you've got incitement to violence, that is then the step too far, which it seems to me really is a misunderstanding of the degree to which harm can be done, not just by words as such, not just words that translate into violence, but also the extent to which words can have a polluting effect on an entire environment. I love the way
it's an arbitrary line, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Like, I think incitement is a clear case, but to think that nothing short of incitement suddenly doesn't do harm,
yes,
I think is an unusual thing. It would be a difficult thing to try to argue, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But even for instance, when a certain group of people, a minority group, a class of people, for instance, when they are transformed from being citizens or from being neighbors or from being proper objects of our civic care and concern to being problems that need to be debated, the very existence of a public debate about their status and place within our common life, that, I think, does a tremendous degree of harm to the lived environment, to the civic climate within which that group of people can then enjoy.
My point is there's no liberal answer to that problem.
No, that's exactly right. But I think what we're pressing here is that the notion of harm, both the harm principle isn't objectionable as such, but the overly restrictive definition of harm, the overly restrictive understanding of harm, the paucity around the conception of harm, I think is really, really problematic.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is if you want to change it, if you want to make that definition more generous, then I think you reach a point of illiberalism anyway.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, because you actually do bring issues, or you do bring conceptions of reciprocity, of
and as someone,
concern.
Right, and as somebody who's not, I wouldn't say I'm a committed liberal. I have my problems with liberalism. Nonetheless, I am, baked in the liberal marinade from birth, given where I've been born and where I've been raised. I would worry about a more expansive definition of the harm principle. Notwithstanding the fact that I would say at various times in my life I have been the recipient of some of those more abstract metaphysical harms that you've discussed.
Well, I'm not sure if they're metaphysical. Anyway, point taken. Let me just shift things, though, for just a moment, though, back to pornography, where we began, because here's where I think the notion of free speech also suffers from a kind of lack of clear definition or an unnecessary restriction. I mean, it seems to me that in all of the conversation about the ability to express oneself, a kind of expressive freedom, what is missed is the principle of reciprocity that is also built into any act of public communication, so that your speech has to be such that the person who hears your speech, the person who is the object of your speech, the person who is invited into conversation, or even the person who lives within the environment in which that speech is projected or is made, there needs to be opportunity for that person to be able to respond in kind. This is the nature of, this is the nature of reciprocity. There needs to be a kind of invitation, a sort of neighborliness that's built into the process of speaking itself. I think one of my problems with so much of what goes under the name of free speech, but also with the way that porn itself enacts a kind of imbalance, is that what it does, and I mean, you and I have talked about this on other occasions, the way that, I mean, just think about the suspicion that often surrounds, okay, she might be saying no, but secretly women really, really want it. Think about the way in which certain groups, certain minorities, members of certain religions might be regarded with a kind of a priori suspicion that when they say this, they don't really mean it. Yeah. That there's an inherent deceptiveness here. There's an attempt to pull the wool. In other words, the very ability to ask others to respond, to express themselves in kind, is neutered, is emasculated in the very process of certain types of speech. And that, for me, and so in other words, it seems to me that instead of being an expression of free speech, that what pornography in fact is, like other forms of, I think, hate speech, what pornography is in fact a violation of the principle, precisely because it destroys the principle of reciprocity.
Well, all I can hear is a lot of people screaming at the radio saying that we're categorizing a really broad range of content under a singular category that may have all kinds of varied effects. I'm not necessarily sure I'm in that school. I can just hear those voices being screamed at me from the other side of the radio. We do have a guest, though, that will help us out tremendously, I think, in this area, because God knows we've made a mess of it. You're listening to The Mindfield. You can listen to the show however you're doing it right now. I assume that involves a radio. It may involve the ABC Listen app, or you can subscribe to our podcast wherever it is that you subscribe to podcasts.
On this particular topic, we could not possibly get a better guest. Ray Langton is Knightbridge Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. In 2015, she delivered the prestigious Locke Lectures at Cambridge University, and she's recently delivered a keynote address at the Griffith Integrity 2017 conference in Brisbane. Ray, it's wonderful to have you on the program.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be here.
So I'm really interested in us eventually discussing whether or not you think that it's right to think about pornography as a kind of species, as a form of hate speech. But even before we get there, I mean, you've heard what Waleed and I have talked about the nature of the harm that can be done by speech. I'm wondering if you'd just like to weigh in on what you just heard. Do you think we need a more expansive, robust definition?
Okay, upload limit. Back immediately.